Our next session we're pleased to kick off is our Farm Families Persistence and Well-Being session. This session will feature two paper presentations, paper entitled Farm Operator Household Well-Being Measurement and Analysis, the Past 50 Years and Future Directions. That will be presented by Dr. Mary Claire Ahern, a fellow at the National Center for Food and Ag Policy and a consulting senior agricultural economist. The paper entitled Factors Associated with Farm Survival and Exit During the COVID-19 Pandemic in Ohio will be presented by Dr. Douglas Jackson Smith, a professor and associate director of the School of Environmental and Natural Resources, Kellogg Endowed Chair of Agroecological Management, and director of the Agroecological Management Program at The Ohio State University. The discussion at the end will be moderated by Dr. Becca Jablonski, an assistant professor and food systems economist at Colorado State University and co-lead of CSU's Food Systems Initiative. Douglas, if you're ready, we will turn it over to you instead to kick us off.
I appreciate the chance to be able to participate in this event. I mean, I think it's a topic that's consumed most of my career, the intersection of farm business and farm household and understanding dynamics of change in agriculture need to be thought through a lens that's much more complex than simply as a simple business calculation. Not to say that economics is not a critical factor, but there are a lot of bigger considerations that intersect in the day-to-day lives of farmers that affect their viability, survival, well-being, and all sorts of outcomes. What I'm going to talk about today is some empirical work that's hot off the presses that looks at the viability of farms in Ohio during the last 3 years, which wasn't by design when we set out to start this project in early 2020 to look at issues of a pandemic, because none of us knew a pandemic was coming, but proved to be a really interesting time period to try to track what are the factors that are associated with farm survival and exit. So if you can go to the next slide. I mean, it's always good to ask why we care. And I won't spend much time on this, but interest in patterns of farm structural change have been around for a long time. We're often focused on what drives farms to exit. And I'll just say as an aside, I won't say much more about it. It's equally important to look at what drives or constrains the ability of people to enter agriculture. But patterns of farm structural change are characterized by longstanding trends towards more consolidation, growth in scale, a lot of specialization, what we often call as the industrialization of agriculture. And many have focused on the loss of sort of a mid-sized farm operation capable of supporting a household or a collection of individuals that without a significant amount of off-farm work. And it's been coupled by growth of the trends towards heavy reliance on off-farm work for farm viability in America. This pattern of farm structural change is linked to a whole variety of outcomes. Some of them might be ecosystem footprint or food system vulnerabilities, efficiencies, and resilience, but also issues of farmer and farm community well-being. And I know the earlier session hinted at it, and I'm quite interested in the topic myself. I won't be talking at all about farm labor today, other than in passing. But these changes also in the restructuring of the labor force and the ways in which the humans involved in agricultural activity are also impacted by how farms are shifting. Now, there is a modest amount of research on farm exit in the United States and other countries as well that focus first and foremost on the economics that might drive why a farm might survive. And these focus on issues of profitability and technical efficiency. And the assumption is that farms that are more competitive economically are more likely to be viable. For those who've read my dissertation, and I assume none of you have, it was 30 years ago and it's really long and I never published most of it. My whole dissertation was looking at questions of farm viability in Wisconsin, dairy farms over a 25-year period of time. And what we found is that these traditional economic indicators were really poor predictors of farm exit. And it generated interest in my work of trying to understand what the other considerations might be. And these often point at households and household dynamics and decisions. The decision to survive as a farm, if it's a household that's running a farm, is very much a household decision, not just a farm business decision. And the balancing of farm and off-farm work, the presence and plans for intergenerational succession or transitions, and the overall quality of life that drives people to become farmers and keeps people in agriculture are often independently important and even more important in driving outcomes. Next slide. So, scientists being scientists, we often do surveys. We also look at secondary data. We try to figure out what the characteristics are of farm businesses and farm households that are more prone to exit. And in short, there's a lot of inconsistent results in the previous work. We know that larger farms are generally more likely to survive or have a reduced tendency to exit. And there's really mixed evidence as to whether relying on rented ground or having insecure land tenure is good or bad in terms of your farm viability, and depending on your strategies, it can play both ways. Dairy farmers in most studies are more likely to exit. We've seen much more rapid loss in dairy farm numbers in the last couple of decades. But crop versus livestock, we get mixed evidence. And strategies like direct marketing, organic production, and diversification, you can go back, please, are often linked to farm viability or proposed for farm resilience, but have mixed evidence in the literature as to whether they protect us from farm exit. However, the best predictors of farm exit have been consistently household and farmer characteristics. Older farmers are more likely to exit. In my dissertation, the best predictor of exit was the age of the operator. And essentially, it was a life cycle decision, not a business decision. Farm experience, though, can lend some protection and insurance. Off-farm work can both facilitate viability, but can also be a pathway to exit. And then exposure to shocks, especially health shocks or weather shocks, and high levels of stress and well-being can be positive predictors of the likelihood of farm exit. Next slide. All right, so our project was really asking the question, is the past a good guide? That's decades of research, all showing the same trajectories of change. But in the last 5 years, my colleagues have pointed out, we've had a black swan event nearly every year. And it could be that we're playing in a new environment, that we need a new way to think about the patterns of farm viability and drivers of farm exit. In particular, rapidly accelerating extreme weather events, 100-year events that happen every 3 years, and all linked to or related to patterns of predicted climate change. Also a period of time in which trade disputes and market volatility have reached new heights. Things that were unthinkable 10 years ago are now kind of taken for granted as the new reality in agricultural economics. And then the pandemic, which no one foresaw, although there was public health people predicting that we're going to get one someday. It finally came home to roost. And how these things played out in agriculture have been the subject of a great deal of speculation and some increasing study in the last couple of years. And in particular, the pandemic literature early on, both in the news and in research articles and commentaries that many of us wrote, focused on how the pandemic revealed vulnerability of this sort of large-scale consolidated specialized food system in agriculture. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm that local direct sales, alternative production systems may have been better positioned for shocks like the pandemic, and thus we might be able to see them surviving or thriving in ways during this last couple year period that we wouldn't see historically. Next slide. So we had a survey that we did in early 2020, did not know the pandemic was coming. We were very interested in the impact of extreme weather events and other kinds of household and farm business stressors on farmer well-being. 2019 was the wettest 12-month period in Ohio history. So we set out to ask that, did a study then. This spring, we resurveyed all of these farmers in order to address the question of whether or not farmers what was the rate of farm exit during the pandemic, how well farm exit intentions that we collected in 2020 predicted actual exit, and what the characteristics were of the farms and households that were leaving agriculture in Ohio over the last few years. Okay, next slide. So the original poll, real quick, was about a statewide survey of 2,500 farms and about 500 specially selected organic farms. We got about a 44% response rate. The results are quite representative of farm characteristics, though I will point out it's an overwhelmingly male respondent pool, which is probably important to some of the interpretation of our results. Next slide. We went back out, want to go forward? Back out this spring and resurveyed all of the respondents from 2020. And did that by sending out a mail survey, reminder postcards, and finally a cleanup postcard. I'll be honest, we're still getting results in, and so the numbers are actually larger in terms of response rates than we see on this slide. But for this presentation, I'll focus in on these 774 people that we feel like we know their current farming status on. And essentially what we found is about 14% of the respondents that we had in 2020 are no longer involved in agriculture. Most of those told us and replied and told us they were no longer farming. Some of them were people that were no longer at that address, and we presume have at least relocated, and we're going to presume have exited agriculture. Next. So a couple, just the cautionary tale. This is fresh data that we're just still processing. There are a lot of questions we want to ask that we haven't had a chance to ask. And so some details when we publish this down the road are going to likely to change. But also a caution that exit, if you study exit, is a very puzzling thing to operationalize. Exit can be an easy thing to throw around, but for different studies, they'll operationalize what exiting from agriculture looks like. Just for us, we're going to talk about people who were farmer respondents in 2020 who told us, or we assume are no longer farming in 2023. Their operation may be operated by somebody else and so forth, but those individuals or those respondents are no longer farming. So we did ask in 2020 whether the people plan to exit as a way of getting some sense of the long-term viability and intentions of operations. And a sizable portion of our sample did say that they plan to exit over the next 5 years, about 200 of the 770 on here. But the majority were planning to continue. And it's an interesting question whether or not that intention was a good predictor of actual exits. What we do see is that those who told us that they intended to exit were about 4 times more likely to exit, but only about 29% of them, let's say, succeeded in their plans over the first 3 years. And so we have the majority of the exiters being in those plan to exit pool, but a large number of those who actually exited were people who did not plan to exit. 48, of those 107 people that are on this slide anyway. And so exit intentions are a useful thing to use to understand patterns of exit, but they're an imperfect predictor. Next slide. So some of the differences we see in terms of the exit rate, and I'll show you a string of these slides, are just looking at the bivariate relationships between a characteristic of an operation and the percentage of their respondents in that characteristic that exited. We'll see that dairy farmers overall, we have about 14.4% of all the farms that exited. Dairy farmers were somewhat more likely to exit in Ohio at a 16% exit rate, with livestock operations also slightly higher and cash grainer operations slightly lower, probably not significantly lower. Interestingly, though, those farms that use a significant amount of non-family labor were much less likely to exit. And I'll just say, as early on, it was a result we did not expect, because so much of the discussion during the pandemic were that farms that were more heavily reliant on hired workers would be those that would be uniquely vulnerable and strategically in a bad position to deal with the stressors that the last couple of years have brought. But in fact, we found in Ohio that those reliant on non-family labor were notably less likely to exit. Next slide. Size has been the best predictor of exit, and like previous work, large farms in Ohio, either measured by acreage or by gross farm income, were less likely, and the largest farms the least likely to exit among these operations, though we did see the highest rate of exit among those sort of small to moderate size operations. And the smallest farms, which we probably would put more in the, depending on the commodities they're raising, more on the lifestyle farm scale, were somewhat less likely than the moderate scale operations. But you see the very similar pattern in terms of the likelihood of exit by scale, no matter how you measure scale. Next slide. We also looked at farms that had heavier debt loads and different kinds of tenure relationships, and found that, interestingly enough, and very unexpectedly, those that had no debt were the most likely to exit. Those with the highest levels of debt back in 2020 were had notably lower rates of farm exit. With tenure, we see some interesting pattern in which mixed tenure, in other words, renting some of your land, was protective or had lower rates of exit, but those who were full tenants had the highest exit rate, and those who were full owners were also somewhat more likely than average to choose to exit. We'll talk a little bit about what that means later. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, other studies have shown, and we've had a lot of discussion around whether alternative marketing, in other words, selling direct to consumers, or marketing into markets that provide premiums like the organic market, are protective of agriculture. And we did find that both cases we had somewhat lower exit rates for direct sales and organic, though those differences were not terribly significant. Next. I spent some time looking at whether the use of different farm management practices, particularly those we associate with more regenerative agriculture, might be indicative of greater farm viability. But what we found is that traditional kind of profit-oriented or production-oriented practices like soil testing and variable rate fertilizer application are just as likely as no-till or cover cropping or using crop rotations or vegetative buffers to provide lower predicted rate of exit. And what I generally see on this slide is that people who are using innovations, be they traditional commercial production innovations or more environmentally oriented system changes, were equally somewhat likely to get a little bit lower rate of exit. The intensive rotational grazing result, I don't have a good explanation for, but the subset of farmers who self-identified as intensive rotational grazers did have an unusually high exit rate over the last 3 years in Ohio. Next. When we shift from that farm business and farm characteristics to farm household characteristics or farmer characteristics, you'll see some interesting patterns. The age of the respondent, as we've seen in other studies, the oldest operators were the most likely to exit, but we also saw that very young operators in the 18 to 34 were similarly vulnerable to higher rates of exit. And in those mid-career operations, mid-career farmers are more likely to be able to survive the last 3 years. We did not find much evidence that how long you've been farming, independent of age, was a good solid predictor of exit. So that's kind of interesting. Next. When we look at household income and education of the respondent, we found that wealthy households had very low rates of farm exit, and households that were financially stressed with what I consider quite low income, under $20,000 a year, were most likely to exit. When it came to education, those with higher levels of formal education tended to have lower rates of exit as well. Next. A couple more slides now, but we did ask back in 2020, because it was a study of extreme weather and other kinds of shocks, whether or not people had these kinds of experiences over the last 2 years. And we bundled shocks into 2 bins. We had the farm shocks, like delayed planting due to rain, or a yield drop by more than 20% in a year, or an extreme weather event. Significant market shocks like a drop in prices. And those are on the left side of that red bar in the middle. Generally speaking, people who had experienced those kinds of business shocks did not have a notably different exit rate, though there were surprisingly enough people who had drought, frost, hail, or extreme weather events in the previous years were less likely to exit, whereas pest and disease outbreak, they're more likely to exit. However, on the household side, things like retiring, having a health crisis, the death of a family member, or getting separated or divorced, generally speaking, were associated with more significant differences in exit rates. And so it's consistent with the idea that what happens in the household and experiences outside of the farm arena per se may have as much, if not more, to do with the viability of farm survival than just the farm business. Next. And finally, and this is a puzzling result to all of us, because most of the literature shows a very strong relationship between measures of psychological distress or perceived stress or perceptions of well-being or maladaptive behaviors. There's lots of scales and measures out there. The way to read this slide is, it's quite different than the other slides, is the blue bars are the non-exiters and the orange bars are the exiters. And so for the average score on a scale of satisfaction, we don't see much difference in how satisfied people were in their exit outcomes. Similarly with stress, those who had higher levels of stress were those who were less likely to exit than those with somewhat lower, or the exiters had a somewhat lower level of overall stress. But the bottom line is we didn't see much association between levels of stress in the spring of 2020 and perceived well-being back then and what happened the next couple of years. All right, wrapping up, some preliminary take-homes. About 15% of our farms exited over the last 3 years in our sample, and that exit intentions are not a bad, but they're somewhat imperfect predictor of actual exit. And a lot of research is just based on exit intention data. So I think that's important to take into account. The best predictors of exit are the age of the operator, household income, and formal education, as well as the presence of these health challenges and household shocks. Things that we're going to be talking about all day today, things that we often don't design farm policy around to protect agriculture, but that we, I think all agree, should be significantly more on our agenda. There are some farm characteristics that are associated with exit, like farm size, where the highest exit is among mid-sized farms, and the fact that land tenure with mixed land tenure was protective. Surprisingly enough, those who relied heavily on non-family labor or at high levels of debt to asset ratios were less likely to exit, and organic and direct marketing were some did not see much impact from farm shocks or from stress and well-being. Next slide. Last slide, you'll be glad. So what do we learn? Big picture. The historic patterns that we've seen for the recent decades didn't seem to change in my reading during the pandemic in Ohio. Large-scale conventional specialized farms were not particularly vulnerable. We often thought that they were early in the pandemic. Those who were innovators, be they environmental innovators or traditional production innovators, were more likely to stay in business. And overall, household drivers remain more important than farm business drivers in predicting farm business viability. Why? Well, I think some of why the pandemic was no different is that the government intervened quite heavily during COVID with relief programs, particularly in agriculture, that papered over or covered for or compensated for the risks and vulnerabilities, particularly of large-scale conventional specialized farms who participated more heavily in programs that were designed for them. In fact, if you follow farm economic data, the last couple of years were some of the best years in American agriculture for large-scale conventional commercial farmers because of the fact that there was adequate compensation that more than compensated them for the shocks that they were experiencing in trade wars as well as the pandemic. I will stop with that and pass it along.
Doug, thanks so much. This is Becca. Before we get to Mary, I have a quick question for you. This is really interesting research. Did you look at associations with any community level factors?
So we have not looked at that yet, but we have geographic information on the respondents that will allow us to kind of look at both. We have their perceptions about their community and the adequacy of their community healthcare access, shopping opportunities, job opportunities, as well as the ability to look at whether there are. Ohio's a very diverse state. We've got well known for our Corn Belt region, but we have Appalachia. We have regions that look like where I live in Ohio that are highly diversified with farms of all types and sizes and scales. And there's some interesting questions about both that community well-being dimension and how protective being in what's perceived as a robust, healthy community were to these operations, as well as whether being surrounded in a landscape that has farms of different types as a community of farms is protective or not protective in different ways.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing more of those results as well, although what you just presented was great. Okay, I'm going to be quiet now and turn it over to Mary. Mary, can you hear us and see us?
Okay, yes. Hello.
Excellent.
I am so happy to be here for so many reasons. I just had some ransomware or something take over my computer, right? At the close of that last very interesting session. So I'm on my laptop. So, and I see on my screen, I see my collaborator here, Ashok Mishra. And Ashok and I have been longtime collaborators, so I was happy he could join me with this. First of all, I want to thank the organizers. It looks like a great program. That the last sessions were very interesting. And just to make sure, can you hear me okay? Is everything all right on the? Wonderful. Okay, so very briefly, the outline of my presentation is to go over the roots of our current farm legislation. And to talk a little bit about sort of the interactions of the policy. So generally, I'm going to talk about it in sort of like 3 phases: early years, interim decades, and the current status, if you will. So first point I'd like to make is that, there's some event in the economy, in the agricultural economy or socially, that moves these policies, and then under the best of circumstances, that leads to improvement in our measurement in the Department of Agriculture and around the states. I'm really going to be emphasizing the national level because that's what I know. I was at ERS for 36 years, retired from that, went back a couple of times, but now I'm with the National Center for Food and Ag Policy part-time. So these early years are going to focus on this concept of parity. People know that word, I think, in ag circles. And the reason that it's relevant talking about household well-being is because you have to have some sort of a standard to compare the well-being to. So whether it's comparing across farms of different types, different sizes, or comparing to the non-farmer, the U.S. population. So in a general sense, that's a very relevant concept. And then I'm calling these interim decades after some Farm Bill responses and then where we are now. And I'm very briefly going to go over research accomplishments in the past 40 years or so. I was attempting to go into more detail on those, and then I realized there's just too much, really useful research. So I'm just going to kind of go through what are about a dozen buckets of topics that have been addressed, and then raise the question of, sort of the looming research questions. But frankly, I'm mostly here to learn from others about those. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, I talk about this interaction among events in society or the economy, policies and analysis, and the Farm Bill explicitly governs those. I've already heard people refer to the Farm Bill, and certainly other laws and regulations, et cetera, affect the well-being of farm households, especially, I think, tax laws, in terms of providing these incentives for farmland owners to hold on to their land until they die, to keep the impacts of the capital gains tax low for their heirs. But rural development, social programs, et cetera, people have talked about childcare, for example, here. I'm mainly going to be talking about ag policies. And to talk about this relationship again between policy and analysis. It's not causal. It's not like the analysis, even though the researchers in the webinar, we do things in the hopes that this will lead to great policy design, but I don't think people on the Hill are clamoring to see the latest results as they go about designing policies. But certainly it educates. There's some sort of information flow, if you will. And then certainly once programs are operational, there's a need for analysis. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so then the roots of our current farm policies go all the way back to 1933. So people are, aware of the Great Depression in this country in 1929, and this was all part of the new New Deal policies. Actually, there was a recession, a depression going on the farm before that. After World War I, all of a sudden that we didn't have the export markets. There wasn't the need to produce a lot. And then the farmers had a lot of overproduction, and it's led to low market prices. And that has been traditionally what we consider the farm problem in this country. And then that was actually the 33 legislation was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The 38 and the 49 legislation were permanent legislation, but since 1965, the Farm Bill expires every 4 or 5 years. Since 1933, there's been 30 farm bills. The current Farm Bill expires in 17 days. No one expects it to be passed with the gridlock going on there. And so the best of circumstances is a continuing resolution. If not, it goes back to, this is why I mentioned the 38 and the 49, the last permanent legislation. That will be what's governing the program. Nobody expects that because of something that's called the dairy cliff. And they make estimates about if we had to revert back to these old policies instead of a CBO estimate of 520 million for the dairy program, it'd be 30 times that. So there's a very good incentive. And then I also mentioned that I think people know that the nutrition title is part of that, funds the SNAP programs, and that's like 3/4 of the whole farm bill. There's often this push to separate those, but that's what brings the urban non-farm interests to vote and to care about this new legislation as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I talked about the farm bill. Do we have the next slide? Okay, so parity in prices. So parity was introduced at a conference by Henry C. Wallace in 1922. And the basic idea here is that output prices should bear a relationship to input prices, seed and other inputs that are used on the farm. And so the idea is that that's sort of a proxy for the non-farm economy. And it goes back to this 1910, 1914 period and maintaining those relationships. It was been redefined several times. The 1948 Farm Bill had more significant changes. But by this time, there was a lot of criticism. Economists had pointed out that, well, these technological relationships aren't static over time. And so it was distorting the markets. NASS still publishes these estimates. So in that event, that we go back to the 38 and the 49 legislation, those parity prices would get put back to use. But after the 1981 legislation, parity prices were largely phased out. Next slide, please. Okay, but what about parity in household income, which is what we're talking about here? First time parity income, as opposed to parity prices, was defined was in 1936 legislation. It was these words in quotes: purchasing power of net income per person on farms, and that compared to the income of per person not on farms. And so this was a series that was published regularly. Although interesting, sadly enough, the language also said, and to develop these statistics with the available statistics. So there was no money to collect anything better. So and frankly, the statistics were not good for producing this on an annual basis. I'd also wanted to point out that there were people, I didn't know this until I was actually preparing this slide, went back and did some historical reading, that practically no one has been completely satisfied with this definition and its measurement. So this is all the way back in 1949, and nothing much was done about that, as in nothing during this interim period. But also noteworthy is the Secretary of the Agriculture at the time, and in terms of his congressional hearings before the Farm Bill, said parity income rather than parity prices should be the ultimate objective of ag policy. I find that really interesting and reminiscent of Reaganomics trickle-down approach. So parity income rather than parity prices is the ultimate objective. So parity income has never been used in farm programs, just to say. There was some reports that based on the 1949 Census of Agriculture collected some interesting data. So they had a typology based on part-time farming and size of farm, et cetera, where they showed how much this parity of income with the non-farm varies across size of farm. And again, just as today, the larger farms actually have a much higher income than the average US household. So I just wanted to point out that, you know, distributional data was recognized way back then. It just, the funds weren't there to collect it and to develop the indicators that are of greatest importance for measuring household income. Okay, next slide, please. So in these interim decades, USDA had this responsibility from Congress to measure these two indicators: disposable personal income of farm and non-farm people, average farm household income from farm and off-farm sources by sales class. So these were constructed and published along with the the current sector incomes. And when I say sector income, perhaps you've had the opportunity to listen to ERS's farm income team led by Carrie Litkowski, Jeff Hopkins, where they put together these estimates of sector-wide, 141.3 billion forecasted for 2023. And these are closely watched by farm groups and farm leaders in USDA, these sector accounts. The other household indicators, back when they were produced, not so much. And in fact, that was one of my assignments early on in the early 80s, was to estimate these. And I was shocked at what was embedded in these computer programs. And of course, states, there's work going on during this period in states. I'm not going to attempt to cover that. There was some important work. ERS joined in with the University of Wisconsin. Mike Duffy had important work, especially focusing on farmland values in Iowa. And then there's farm record systems in several places. And also there's follow-on surveys that came with the census about every 10 years for a while. But the key here, access was not allowed to individual researchers. And, we would get from the censuses, for example, to estimate net farm income, we'd get these big, if you remember the big computer printouts that, and we'd get state averages for all sorts of items. Next slide, please. Before we leave that, though, I did want to point out that there was some interest that in farm women. I actually have one of the books here. If you haven't seen it, it's a nice history. But I mean, basically, women were unaccounted for in agriculture. It was, principal operator, the man on the person on the list as a farm operator was almost always a man, and there would be one identified. And so it was recognized that, something, people in USDA recognized it, provided some money to NORC to cooperate on a survey. And, lo and behold, women were discovered as an important labor source and management source in particular on US farms. There were others, later studies at Penn State, between ag economists and rural sociologists there, and currently one in Idaho, and I'm sure there's others. Next slide, please. Okay, so this would be the beginning of this last phase I wanted to talk about. And the farm financial crisis, I think most people knew about it. It was fun to search on the web for some of these pictures from the American agricultural movement. I had just started at USDA, just moved to Washington and only been there for about 6 months when all of this was taking place. And I said, all right, people are bringing the issues to their politicians. It was pretty crazy. It was all on the mall. The mall was destroyed with the tractors, and the beltway, it was gridlock. It was pretty crazy. About this time, part of the reason behind this was, again, there was a lot of production, prices were low, and what had happened was the Secretary of Agriculture before this time was Secretary Earl Butz, who really is known for saying a lot of inappropriate things, including racist statements. But he also told farmers to go out and plant fence row to fence row and get big or get out. So, farmers taking this direction, and with the market conditions at the time, including especially in the international arena, they incurred a lot of high debt, but not all of them did. But we did not have current information in the Department of Agriculture to really understand this problem. So this precipitated, next slide, please. The leaders in USDA, and I'm sure this happened at a relatively high level. I was not in the room when it happened, but I now know enough to know that this is not something sort of branch chiefs responsible for survey or estimates could make happen unilaterally. This was, with that incentive to respond to the farm crisis. people came together from these two agencies. I think they had different names at the time. They weren't, but they're the predecessors to the current ERS and NASS, and produced the Farm Cost and Return Survey. So first year data was 1984. It merged the Farm Production Expenditure Survey, and it also the cost of production cost, and that was used at the time to set target prices in ag programs. So it was just saying, say, for a particular commodity, what's the cost and returns associated with producing a bushel of corn or a hundredweight of milk. And so this was on the ERS side was led by Jim Johnson to get that job done once the higher ups had decided that the budget could be there. And basically it means rearranging all of the budget priorities. John Lee was the administrator at the time. And then especially, again, I want to emphasize this, access to individual records was granted. We had one big room, maybe the size of somebody's living room, and crammed with computers. Only about half a dozen people, maybe 8 people were allowed in this room. And we kind of shared these computers to get access to it. Because of course, NASS and USDA at large wants to protect the confidentiality of the respondents. And some university people came in. I remember Damona Joy from Oklahoma State came in. They were allowed to come in. Of course, it's expensive. And there's were a lot of reviews before any data left that room. So the first journal publication was right after that at the AEA meetings in August, and looked at farm households. The first publication from the survey that was an ERS product, because it dealt with this whole issue of financial stress, which was the main cause of the farm crisis, came out in 85 as well. And then the first publication on how production costs varied. So we can make statements for the first time, instead of saying Iowa corn cost per bushel is X and Illinois is something else, we could say a certain percentage of farms have a cost of production below the market price. So much more distributional. Next slide, please. Okay, so out with the old, in with the new. And we're still in this good, I think, golden period where we have a vehicle and for collecting information to analyze households. So I was responsible for what I'm calling these flawed, misleading indicators at the time. And I thought there was going to be pushback for just jettison them, because there was things called wedge factors, which is not a statistical thing. And they were pulling aggregated data from all sorts of different sources. Managers in ERS were very supportive of getting rid of this. There was an important user, however, Bruce Gardner, who's a very well-respected economist, who was a user of these. And so we had a lot of discussions. He came into USDA. We had an exchange in choices about, does he really believe these? Because the survey was showing different relationships, that on average, for example, farmers were not low income compared to what was expected in sort of anecdotally and described by these flawed indicators in terms of low income relative to the farmers. But of course, as we know, because of distributional data, it really varies by size of farm and any other way you want to classify the farms. And then there was the Family Farm Report, which had been required by Congress, started using the FCRS data. Many of you may know Bob Hoppe did that report as a lead author for many years. Okay, so there were challenges, though, in moving to the FCRS, because again, that was a unit of analysis was the farm business and not the farm household. So, I had issues with defining what is the population. Is it principal farm operator households? But what about if you have a partner who gets part of the income? A lot of that had to be sorted out. And then what's the measure of income? And so I went with the CPS type of a definition so that we could easily compare it to the US households, where in the past there was a non-money income for the value of living in the dwelling, et cetera. So the introductory 1996 report included an analysis of alternative data sources, so that users could have a bridge between the old and the new. And most of those populations come from the CPS, but none of them really capture farm operator household population. It's like, do you get some farm self-employment income? Well, other people like landlords could get some farm self-employment income. So populations just weren't clean. And then another thing that's still, I think, an issue for the typology then and now is the focus in our typologies on the major occupation of a principal operator, when in fact, this is a unit. This is commonly, two partners living in the same household, whether they're married or not. And yet we focus on a principal operator and the major occupation. What's the major occupation where you make your most money, where you put your hours in. So there's still some issues in sorting that out. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here are those three early reports. So this orange one here was released in '86. And again, this was trying to give a walk through from the old to the new for users. We had a typology in here. We also had another typology from a really nice conference just like this that Jill Fendice and others at Penn State put together. This was the proceedings of that. And John Lee and I had a chapter in there. We had another version of the typology. You probably are aware, or you should be aware of the current one. It's changed a few times since then. And then the second, this was, well received, and the managers at the ERS said, oh, well, let's have a whole section. So I was able to hire some people. This next report includes co-authors Janet Perry and Hisham El Asta. As I mentioned, Bob Hoppe joined the group. After the Secretary of Agriculture, Espy at the time, read the report, these reports sort of crossed the Secretary's desk, and he actually read this one, and he had just been briefed on the aggregate farm income statistics, and they were telling different stories. So he said, wait a second, we got a briefing, we explained it. And then he then said, from now on, when you publish the aggregate statistics, you need to also publish more of this distributional information about how households are doing. And then this next one is Ashok Mishra, who's collaborating on this, was the lead on that. And among the authors, you could see there's many authors there. The work has grown in terms of importance, includes Jeff Hopkins, the current branch chief of the Farm Income and Household Wellbeing section. Okay, next slide. So there was then another opportunity to merge the FCRS into what perhaps you know about today, the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. So at that time, we had a series of acting administrators and a 25% budget cut. So again, we had this sort of internal incentive to be more efficient in data collection and recognize what we had learned from the other one. So the Jim Johnson was still in charge of the FCRS. I was now in charge of some environmental surveys in another division. And we were assigned to collaborate and with two partners, Cynthia Clark and Sam Reeve, the NAS, and we created the ARMS. And a lot of the issues had been already on the household, measuring household income, had been decided from the earlier experience. But it's still major challenges in terms of allocating the budget for sample size and different issues. I understand from a longtime collaborator, Ginger Harris at NAS, that they're having some extra effort on making sure some underserved populations have large enough samples, because that's always been the challenge. Okay, next. Now here are the current projects. Christine Witt and her colleagues there in the Economic Research Service, you may have seen America's Farmers and Ranchers at a Glance. So they're much different publications now. And those earlier ones, they were really about getting lots of statistics out, perhaps some like you're familiar with the Census of Agriculture. Now, you know, there's much more focus on distilling the statistics. And then the next chart is just one of the many charts from the briefing room. If you haven't visited the briefing room, lots of good Excel tables to take a look at. Okay, next. Okay, so here's where hopefully I'm not taking too much time, but here's where I was sort of being too bold. I was going to try and say what are the answers we have to the questions we've addressed. And all I could do was sort of come up with these buckets, but certainly anything with off-farm labor and, you know, time allocation. And we've already just heard this in the previous panel, talking about the challenge. You want to bring in the income from off-farm work, and you want to bring in the health benefits, et cetera. But we also looked at sort of how these labor allocations in a household change when payments are decoupled, or any new program that comes along. The opportunity cost of unpaid farm work, because in a lot of the small farm sector, of course, most of the labor comes from unpaid farm work. But in doing our models, we want to estimate, you know, well, what's the value of that? What's their opportunity cost? Government distribution of government support and the impacts on income and net worth are always important. Risk management has been looked at. Land values, again, this is even before these new surveys. It was recognized that government payments can get capitalized into land values and rent. So a lot of work on this subject. And how different sources of income contribute to income inequality. So there's Hisham El-Asta especially had led a big program on that. And of course, there's a lot more discussion in the general economy about the challenges of income inequality in our country. Access to healthcare. So including insurance coverage, farm and US population, influence of health insurance. So, you know, this was a challenge to collect the data, because of course, different members of one household can have different levels of coverage, as we know. But here's an example of where we recognize, you know, this was an important issue for farm families, and then it was before the Affordable Care Act. So, you know, this having access to a survey instrument on an annual basis allows us to foresee some issues that could be coming down the road, and we were able to educate policymakers as they were formulating policies. Influence of health insurance on that choice of off-farm work, time use of households compared to other self-employed. And then again, this importance of the financial constraints, which the financial crisis is what led to the investment in this database. And then transitions too, entry and exit. There's some good work in entry and exit. Doug just talked some about that and his work. And then the performance of these socially, you know, nobody likes the term socially disadvantaged, but these subpopulations that traditionally have been underserved, or that are important just because they're the future of agriculture. We were able to target them sort of before these became really focused policy issues. And then I was just sort of saying this linking of data from, on, say, county level or some sort of a local area data to understand the links between agriculture and rural America. And we were ready when policies were being developed, and to look at the use of differing market channels. And some of you may be familiar with Kathleen Merrigan's lead on the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food. And so we had some work in the pipeline and even finished on that, as well as contracting. Okay, so that's sort of, again, the buckets I'm saying of what we've done. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, sort of future opportunities, this is where I feel really like you all collectively know more than I do as a single person who's been retired even here. But I still think labor issues are critical for how farm families are responding to the farm labor shortage that we have in this country, and including their allocation of time to farm and off-farm work. And then, not unrelated, is precision ag adoption. There's some good work in the literature. James, I'm not going to get his name right, Lowenberg, not going to get it, sorry, I'm going to butcher his name, so I'll stop there. And John McFadden at ERS, but others around the country. There's some regional projects going on. So which of these technologies are scale neutral? And ARS as well is doing some work in this area. So, but there's some challenges in using the database, because any of these emerging technologies, you're automatically going to have small sample sizes. So you can merge some of the samples across the years. And then the conservation programs, they received a significant increase in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's some interest in taking some of that money back for some of the traditional farm programs, and who knows where that will end up. But what are these climate smart ag technologies, and are they, what size farm are they appropriate for? Native Americans in Indian country have historically been a challenge in data collection, but NASS has made significant progress over the last 20 years, say. Again, Ginger Harris and Michelle Raddick, I believe, at NASS have a long history of chipping away at this and improving the list in the area frames in Indian country. And there's now Farm Bill Coalition, because they basically weren't included in the Farm Bill in the past, and that has changed in recent years. And what are their needs as an underserved group? And also, when I talk about underserved groups, I really think that there's it'll be interesting to see how the latest Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, how it will affect these programs that have been designed to target people based on gender and race, for example. But the important part is, are they underserved? And so what are the ways that don't target gender and race, for example, that we can identify who's underserved? And then access to broadband is really, very exciting that there's finally been more investment, and we'll see how that plays out, how that affects rural job opportunities, as well as on-farm precision ag. And then the whole issue of childcare, which has been talked about. So Shauna, I invited her to a beginning farmer. That's where I first crossed paths with her. In the administration building. I don't know how long ago it was, Shoshana, but she really caught my attention, which is why I wanted to include her when she was talking about childcare. I had sort of thought it was bold for us to talk about, 10 years ago, she said, to talk about healthcare when we talk about farmers. In fact, earlier, it was really bold for me to want to ask about the demographics of the spouse. So now here this, young whippersnapper is wanting to talk about childcare. It's like right on. So anyway, I was interested to see the progress that has been made in that area, and the recognition, again, is an example of where this is now a national issue. This is not just a farm issue. So being, ahead of these issues by paying attention to the farm media is, really important. I read the Agree newsletter almost religiously, but there's lots of others, National Sustainable Ag, American Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union. I read it all to see kind of, what are the issues, and, is there a research question that can be formulated to address these issues and perhaps lead to improved policy design. And that is the end for me. But again, I want to thank the organizers of this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mary. That was awesome. I really, really enjoyed that. Actually, the whole, I think, 2 hours we've spent together so far this morning have been wonderful. And I just want to echo Mary's comments of thanks to all the organizers here, and particularly Ashley Spalding and Jeff Hopkins at USDA ERS, the Farm Foundation team, and Florence Beacock, and also to Shoshana Inwood. This is a conversation that I think has been long in coming, and much of it, really due to Mary's work over many, many years, along with a lot of collaborators that she mentioned. So there are some great questions in the chat box, but I want to start off and ask a very specific question. I hope that's okay. We have a lot of sort of detailed thinkers on the call. So, the 2017 census switched how we ask about operators. And I just want to ask really quickly before we get into some of these other pieces about if you think, and we could start with Mary here, that that's going to make a difference in, how we're really able to characterize farms and farm households and analyze some of these issues, or how you might make additional changes, particularly to the census, that would enable us to do a better job in answering some of the questions you were talking about. So Mary, do you want to start with that, and then we'll go to Doug?
Yeah, I may not be the best person, but that never stops me from talking. So, hey, so, some of these, I think it will help, but, not every variable needs to be put into a typology, like for classification purposes. But that doesn't mean sometimes there's, and this is my own, I know different people will have different opinion about this that I respect. But there's a lot to be said for having a simple typology and then looking at sort of like separating, having a second level where you separate that out. So, maybe farm size is the obvious one historically. So then maybe you separate that out. Like, I've looked at it before, for example, like, when there's just a husband who's an operator, or when it's jointly operated, or when it's a single operator. So then kind of subclassify, and certainly then report that. But there's just so much diversity in U.S. agriculture, which is, to me, its strength and gives it its resiliency, that it's hard to we always want to kind of collapse things pretty simply, and sometimes it's difficult. That does not, and we've been collecting, or I should say now ERS has been collecting questions from multiple operators on the ARMs for a while, and often they get collected on ARMs, and then they get collected on the future censuses. So, but I don't know if there's anybody here from NASS or Jeff Hopkins and his group. I would really like to hear their response.
Well, maybe before we turn it over to Jeff, who I believe is joining us on his vacation, we can
Dedicated.
That's how dedicated he is. Doug, do you have anything you want to add about that? And, or, if you want to answer it, not just from the census perspective, but maybe on, and how you implement your survey to sort of get around, some of these challenges, you can answer it that way too.
Right. I mean, let me just say, relative to I think the innovation is going to be terribly important in helping us unpack some of the complexities that we've glossed over in the past. So we know that the number of operators, the role of women in particular, was undercounted and underappreciated because of the culture of response, which would prioritize the male-centric response, which, as I said, we see in our survey as well. But the issues will be comparing things through time. Anytime you change the census, anytime you do those things, and already I think they are challenges, but I think when we reset for reasons that make sense, that'll allow us to look at trends and implications in the future. The other comment I was going to make is relative to farm viability and exit. I made a hint or a side comment that it's awfully hard to define what you mean by exit. And we have so many operations that don't fit a simple mold of a single operator and a single farm that exists as long as that person runs that operation. There's a lot of handing off of operations between members of the household, shifting roles through time. Particularly as you get households that are, coming together and adding people or separating and losing people, it's difficult to see the moment when there's a clean start and end. So we, for the work I presented, focused on the person who filled out the survey, who we collected some information about them and whether or not they were still farming or they considered that farm still in their hands. We know some of the people who've exited, by our definition, have that farm is still being farmed, but farmed by somebody else, maybe somebody they sold it to or somebody that acquired it or has taken it over. And so these are the complexities where having that level of detail is going to help shed a little bit more light on these transitions, that I think will be terribly important. But we did ask
Thanks.
questions that I didn't report on that we can characterize the households in a lot more detail. We followed that model and tried to get better information about the different people who are in the household. It's just difficult for us to link to this exit analysis and the stuff that I presented today. But
Thank you. There are so many good questions, both in the Q&A and the chat box. I'm going to move us away from data for 1 second, but I'm going to come back and Zoe, you put a number of good questions and comments in the chat box. So when we come back to data, if you want to unmute and ask any of those, that would be welcome. But while I'm giving you a minute here. So, Mary, you mentioned early in your presentation that people on the Hill aren't clamoring to hear the latest research. But then you sort of transitioned to talking about how, Shoshana was there sort of at meetings talking about, these issues around childcare and healthcare. And Doug, clearly your work, has you're doing this in part because you want to be able to communicate to, I'm assuming, mostly statewide lawmakers. So can you both maybe talk about how you see that the past work and current work can best be communicated to people who are in positions of power to make changes to policy? Doug, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so the 2020 Farm Poll was and I did this with Shoshana Inwood, so it was a joint effort, and she's got as much of her fingers in it as I do, to be fair, was designed to gather parallel information about household level questions and farm business questions or farm characteristics. And we were trying to tease out to what degree are shocks and events and dynamics within the household important in parallel to the kinds of questions that had received a whole lot more attention in the state farm community and the farm politics of the in our university and our extension services. Over the last couple of years, we've mined those data to, with good empirical results, hammer home the significance of issues like childcare, the significance of issues like health, and the gravity and severity and the depth of the community that's affected by those issues, which hadn't been front and center. And I don't think it's solely because of us. There's a lot of other moving pieces, but the narrative within, say, the State Farm Bureau conversation and some of the state political conversations at the legislature and in our congressional representation has shifted to a much greater appreciation than I've seen for decades towards elevating the household and well-being conversation. I still think the dominant narratives and the dominant ways we think of farming as principally a business and principally need that the appropriate responses are production centered, not things that we would do for the rest of society, as someone pointed out during the first session. But they're equally important for the well-being of farmers, is awfully hard to overcome. And that's true in the state of Ohio, and it's definitely true in the Farm Bill conversations that we're watching.
Before Mary goes, Doug, what do you think the tipping point was, though, in terms of now you're saying you're hearing about childcare and healthcare more? I mean, what do you think caused that? Was it a combination of some of the results coming out? Was it just enough sentiment coming from sort of stakeholders and communities that politicians were talking to?
Well, it's hard for me to put a finger on that. I'd say Shoshana Inwood's arrival in Ohio is not a small part of that story. And the fact that she's been hammering this before we did our project, as we've rolled those. And we spent a lot of time with a lot of support from colleagues packaging these messages and these results in ways that academics are usually pretty bad at. So we've got, blogs and vlogs and podcasts and easy access resources. And I'll put in the chat a link to some of those resources if people want to track that down. But I think that's partly it, but the work has to be face to face, has to be going to where people are at. And Shoshana Inwood's been doing a lot of that work nationally and in the state. And so I give her most of the credit if we've had anything to do with it.
Great. Mary, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Well, first thing I want to make clear is that ERS and NAS and ARS, they're all part of a research mission area. So it's not their job to design policy. It's more about putting out facts that could contribute to good policy design. Now, that doesn't, the secretary's office, can suggest programs or options. So, but what I think really, the congressional committees are listening to their constituents. So the, American Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union, the different groups. I already mentioned National Sustainable Ag, Farm Women's Group, whatever, they're listening to those, and that's why they have these listening sessions around the country. Of course, just like every other, policy design, the lobbyists have a lot of sway in the discussion. So what I really think social scientists have their impact is on, educating the public, the general public, and all of these groups that then really do have the clout. Of course, they translate it into their special interests.
Thanks, Mary. Zoe, do you mind unmuting yourself and asking a couple of the questions that you had in the chat box?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you both, Doug and Mary, for these presentations. I guess I was asking about, I was just really interested, Mary, in what you said about the income parity kind of point from early in the Farm Bill history. And then I was asking in the chat about, do we also see some information, like has there been work on looking at wealth parity as well? And Ashok, pointed me to some things in the chat that I would encourage other folks to look at. I was Googling during the presentation to kind of look those up. But I'm curious from a policy perspective, and again, I know you just noted that, these entities are involved in research and not policy formation, but it seems to me that a lot of the results, like you look at the top line results from those reports and they say, well, most farm households have more wealth than the rest of US households. And when we look at income, some, the richest farms have more income than US households. The poorest resource farms have less income than US households. It doesn't seem to me like that's actually entered the farm policy conversation in a substantial way. And I'm just curious about your kind of, and Ashok said it has, but some farmers have got around it. And that got me interested in what does he mean exactly? Because we still see a lot of farm programs where there's lots of funds that are getting dedicated to some of the highest income and wealthiest farms in the US. And we're looking at these programs like childcare, or gosh, it'd be nice if some of these other things got some of these funds that don't seem to be targeted based on this income or wealth parity idea. And so I was just curious, that's a long question, but that's kind of where the nature of my questions, and I'd be curious if you all or others had any response to that.
Well, if I'm going to go first, so and this would be a great time for Ashok to join in if he can do that as well. So there he is. So part of the program in the past several decades has to recognize the importance of wealth, because of course, even though it may not be liquid, you could borrow from it, etc. And there's a saying that farmers live poor and die rich. And that's because of the importance of wealth. So there has been lots of activity in the research community on this, including annuitizing that wealth into an annual amount. But I think that maybe the issue here is that the farm bills are trying to address all issues. So of course we need, you know, our large farms to produce the commodities that they produce, and we also need the small farm sector. So it's, you know, so it's really a farm bill for all purposes. So I don't think it's ever been, even though the secretary said it, it really should be this kind of trickle down sort of an approach. We should look at parity in programs, parity in prices, as really the ultimate goal is more parity in income. But it's got lots of purposes that it's juggling. I know that's not, you know, a very good answer. At least I'm not satisfied with it. So I'm going to ask Ashok to jump in.
Oh, thanks, Mary. But I think, like you said it correctly, the program payments are meant to produce more food and fiber, and who's going to produce more food and fiber? The payments are geared towards those commodities, and then the incentive to go large or go home kind of stuff, you know. So that has created and fed on itself, and that's what you see, a bipolar farm sizing of large farms producing 90% of the product and 90% of the farm producing 10% of the product. So those are, again, you know, the farm policy are driven by the lobbyist and the lobbying group and who can lobby the most. And famously said by Supreme Court case, you know, corporations are people, my friend. So that's where rubber hits the road. And that's the result of what you're seeing nowadays. We have done so much research, as Bruce would say, we have done so much research on showing that the policies are not working for the intended purposes and those kind of things, but still we are doing the same thing again and again. And as any developing or developed country, and over the years, if you don't have regulations and policies that protects the middle class, so my friend, if you want to see a real democracy with no rules and regulations, go visit India. So you will see what we are talking about. So there needs to be a certain amount of oversight and regulations that makes the middle class stronger, not the bipolar kind of thing. Same thing, stories happening in the farming sector itself too. So,
yeah. Can I add on to the resilience of the small farm sector is impressive. I guess it was in the late 70s, before information was available. The Congress had something called the Office of Technology Assessment, and they predicted that there wouldn't be any small farms, that there was going to be about, I think it was by the year, it was in the 2010s or something like that, there was going to be 1 million farms and there weren't going to be any small farms. Well, you know, they were wrong. And that's because of this, the motivations of that generation, and they were able to stay on the farm and build some wealth through their work off the farm.
Yeah, and the series that, Mary, I think you and many others were responsible for, maybe Bill McBride and some others, for the, what is it, the persistence of the small farm, that came out in the early aughts, the series of papers.
Yeah, I'm not sure all the people involved in that.
But that was great. I mean, that really influenced me as a, you know, young researcher in thinking about really kind of what's going on here, right? Why do we see this persistence? And, you know, I think in Doug's findings, it's interesting where you see, right, the folks that are most likely to exit aren't the really small, but, you know, slightly larger than that. So we are going to invite Jeff Hopkins in to make a few comments here. I think, Jeff, particularly, if you wanted to comment on some of what Mary had said, you know, given that you are now at the sort of cutting edge space of where we're headed, thinking about data and research, it would be great to hear your comment.
Thanks, Becca, and it's really wonderful to join everybody today. I'm really pleased that we got so many people to talk about farm households' social and economic needs. So the only thing that I wanted to add was the continuing efforts of our survey program to gather data on farm households, in addition to understanding the performance of farm operations. is an ongoing challenge. People talked about the typology, and the typology is really the intersection of the primary occupation of the principal operator and the size of the farm. So it's really intersecting just those two variables. And it's only doing it for the principal operator. And the challenge, because we've been gathering information on the demographics and characteristics of the other operators on that farm operation, is how we can talk about the farm households of this multiplicity of farm operators where they exist. The majority of farms are two spouses who are operating a farm, but there are many other types of farms that have evolved over time, including non-family farms, meaning that none of the individual operators owns more than 50% of the assets of the farm. So we know that there are a number of very important contributors to overall agricultural production in the ag sector, and we need to have a probably more nuanced type of farm typology. So it is something that we're very interested in building a more nuanced farm typology. We do have some of that data because we have a greater understanding of the people who have decision-making authority on farms, what they're doing on that farm, but we'd like to know more about all the households that are associated with that farm, or in a more illustrative way, talk about the farm household of households other than the principal operator. So it is something that we're very interested in doing, and your guidance and your thoughts are appreciated in how to go about doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think the point that Mary brought up earlier around, doing some sort of oversampling in the latest ARMS survey of, historically underserved households is really important. But I think part of the farm typology challenge is that for these sort of segments of socially disadvantaged operations, we've had not as much information too. And we know that there are some, historical legacy issues that need to be accounted for. So I think there's so many interesting issues here, and it's great to have fantastic people such as yourself at USDA who are thinking critically about these issues, and also people like Doug and Shoshana that are also implementing some statewide surveys to be able to ask questions we may not be able to through some of our national data. So I know we are almost out of time in this great session. So Doug, my last question for you is, if there's going to be sort of one takeaway from the research that you've done so far that you want people to leave with, that's sort of an actionable item, what is it?
Well, it's preaching to the choir, but probably that if you care about farm viability and exit, you should focus as much on the household side as on the farm business side.
Great takeaway. And Mary, I'm wondering, given your, historical perspective on all of this, which is just so helpful for all of us to keep in mind, is there something that you think maybe we were doing better previously, right? When some of these survey instruments or the research started in these spaces that would be important for us to keep in mind moving forward?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify, I was not around in 1933.
I
Just for the record. But no, I can't think of anything that they were doing better. But I think that when you read back on the literature, there was a lot of awareness about what the challenges were. There just needed to be the will to put the resources there. So no, I think I'm biased here, but I think everything Jeff's doing is better than what's been done in the past.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much to you both. Please join me in giving a round of applause. We can, just do it with emojis or whatever they're called via Zoom. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Martha to give us instructions on where to head next.
Yes, so thank you, Becca, Mary, Douglas, everyone for sharing your research perspectives with us